Looks like we're live. This is the Talent War Group webinar 19, January 28th, 2021. It's a full moon out, and Chris and I are going to dive into a deep and exciting topic. But first, I'm going to go ahead and go over some important information, and we're going to get to it. So today is personal goal setting is important for resilient mental health. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Luna, and I'll be your host. This is the Talent War Group. This is an organization of experts who share their lessons learned and insights on talent management, leadership, and organizational development. We rely on your growing support and wouldn't be here without it. If you like what you hear, share it with connections and contacts. I'm a little biased towards today. So please, if you like what you hear, share it with somebody that can take something powerful from our conversation today. If you have questions and comments, please send them through the chat function, and we'll do our best to address them during the section. So brief topic intro, today's session, goal setting can be used for a lot of different ways. We can use goal setting in our personal lives to move to a healthier way of life and build closer relationships. We can use goal setting in our professional lives to better manage our time or move to the next position. Goals also tend to be specific and measurable. In this podcast, we're going to shift perspective on traditional goal setting and speak about some other ways to use this traditional practice. Not all goals have to be specific or measurable. And we can also use goals for personal empowerment and to ground us during times of uncertainty. Thank you for joining us for this conversation and tips to upgrade your goal setting practice. I'm joined today with Chris Frueh. He is a PhD in clinical psychology. He has a PhD in clinical psychology, and he is a professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii. He is a speaker and contributor with the Talent War Group and performance specialist with Grego Solutions. He has almost 30 years of professional experience working with military veterans and active duty personnel. As a clinician, researcher, and most recently a performance optimization coach working with the special operations community. I can elaborate more on Chris. I will say this, he is a mentor of mine and has been a huge supporter to me, both in my personal and professional life. So I'm excited to have Chris with me today. My name is Dan Luna. I'm a certified leadership coach and a doctoral student at USC. My work is focused on organizational pre-trauma. I run a small leadership coaching company called Team 3LX. In 2020, I published Leading from Within, a leadership guided journal. I'm a retired Navy SEAL who served at SEAL Team 1, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, and the United States Naval Academy. I'm really excited for today's topic, and I'm ready to dive into it. Chris, I have a bunch of notes. I have probably 2 pages of notes for this conversation, and that actually brings me to another reminder. For those listening and joining us today, if you're able to take notes, I highly recommend it. My intent, and I know every time I talk to Chris, I'm always writing a lot of notes and a lot of things that I'll reflect on later on. So I highly recommend you take notes on today's session, and let's dive into it. Chris,
Let's do it.
Is there anything that you want to cover before I start bombarding you with questions?
Well, yeah, there's 2 things, and one is, I think, just to tell a story about 2 Christmases ago and what we did. And I was blessed to have the entire Luna family come out to Hawaii and visit with me for a week, maybe 8 days. And one of the things that we all did together, Dan and his lovely wife Leslie and their 2 kids and Dan's charming mother, we sat around my kitchen table and we did a planning exercise for the new year, 2020, that was to come. Of course, nobody knew at that time what was about to happen. But I went back through my the notes that I wrote on that exercise that you led that day, Dan, and discovered that one of my top goals for the year 2020 was to travel less. So, the joke was on me. I haven't traveled hardly at all in 2020. In fact, that whole thing, we may have just jinxed the whole year right there with that little exercise. So I do want to give I think maybe for me, I'd like to start with what are, some good timeless wisdom. And I was reviewing an article by my friend Jennifer Shambrook today at the University of Central Florida. And she wrote a really nice sort of executive blog where she talked about goal setting and reminded us that the tradition of goal setting is to have goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to our lives, and time-bound, meaning deadlines and time frames. And that's the traditional perspective on goal setting, and it's certainly not wrong. There's a whole lot to like about all of those elements, and I've used them myself. But I think today, Dan, you and I are going to kind of go, and talk around some of that and come back to it. And so I know there's a lot of ideas on how to do this. So back over to you.
Before we dive into that, Chris, what I'd like to hit is, so even just in the title, personal goal setting is important for resilient mental health. And I really like...
What the heck is resilient?
There it is. And so if we can, before we even get into the goal setting, if we can just touch on this, this word resilient. What are your thoughts?
Well, resilience is a very popular word. I like it myself. But what does it mean? And is there a consensus on what it means? Do the experts, the so-called experts, do they know what it means? And I don't think they do. I don't think there's a consensus on what it means. For some people, resilience is about the front end of adversity, and for others, it's about the back end of adversity. So, Dan, when you're thinking of resilience, what are you thinking of? How do you use the term?
So, I agree with you 100%. The research that I'm doing right now, I see resilience in the academic arena used two different ways. And I have an issue with how it's used. So resilience in academia is used either to push through something or to move back or to move away from something. And I think the word is extremely confusing, because if I were to give you directions and say, hey, move away from something or move into something, if it's something where there's a high consequence or a threat, that's a pretty big deal to take a step forward or to take a step back. And depending on what it is, you could get burned moving forward, or moving back, you could actually be moving back to safety, so away from a threat. So I think because a lot of the confusion around it, and I've had different discussions with a lot of folks in academia, specifically around this word, how it's used so frequently is to push, is to endure, is to persevere, is to be gritty, is to be hardy. And that's that moving forward. There's something tough and you have to like go through and push through it. And I actually disagree with that, with the use of resilient in that way. There's other words that describe that forward movement, and we have a lot of words to describe that. However, what words do we have to move away from that, to move back to wholeness, to move back to an equilibrium, to take a knee, to take a break? What word is that? That word is actually resilient. So it's moving back to wholeness. And when I work with my clients, I like using the term moving back to aliveness. Like, what gives you joy? So if there's work, then there's play. And it really gives us that balance in life. And I think the misuse of resilient, we are doing a lot of people a disservice by misusing it, Because what are we doing to balance out that hardship? I don't work out for 24 hours straight during the day. What is the other piece of working out? Recovery, sleep, and nutrition. These things where you take a break. And so resilience to me is that. It's, hey, how do you move back to a place of resilience? And I'll pause there.
So if I could chime in. So I think what let me make sure I'm understanding this. So let's imagine a timeline. And let's put a point on that timeline, and let's just call that adversity. That could be many different things, whatever that adversity is. In the timeline before the adversity, as you're approaching it, there's whatever you do to prepare and you get ready for that. And then after the adversity, which often suggests some level of depletion of resources or damage to some system in the body or the brain or the psyche. You're saying you're putting resilience on the post-adversity part of that timeline. Have I got that right? That for you, resilience is post-adversity. It's the recovery. It's the resuming or the resumption of wellness and balance and status quo.
Yes.
I get that. Did I get that right? Okay.
Yes.
So now, where do we go with that? What's the connection from that to goal setting?
Great question, Chris. What are your thoughts?
No, you can't do that, man. You're the freaking host of this thing. So you can't just ask me the deep questions. You got to be able to field the questions as well.
So here's my take on using resilience for mental health. So more often than not, when I'm working with my clients, it's performance, it's go, it's, how do you design, and I'm going to use working out as the analogy. How do you design the workout? How do I move through this thing? How do I continue to get stronger? How do I make my day more efficient? How do I accomplish all these things in 7 days, 24 hours? How do I get this done? And I'll work with them on that. Typically, they're doing a pretty good job at that already. And almost always, the gap is not taking care of themselves. And so we'll start out. So an easy win with me is, hey, what is a resilient practice? And so we'll talk about the meaning of the word resilient, like we just did. And the next thing is just, hey, where does resilience show up in your life? What are the things that you do for yourself that recharges you? So using that timeline that you just laid out. So if adversity or if there's something that takes your energy, what is something that gives you back that energy? And it's something different for everyone. There are some fundamental things that are there. Time in nature, meditation, prayer, taking control of the day, aspects of the day, going for walks. So there's working out, exercise. So there's universals, but now for the individual to just take the time and see what connects for them and where it shows up in their day.
Okay, so let's break this down. I'm going to give you a very specific example from my own recent life. And again, just to, the traditional perspective on goals is to have them be measurable, specific, achievable, relevant, time-bound. Thank you, Jennifer Shambrook. So my goal, my recent experience with very specific goal setting met all of those criteria. So I did Sober October at the end of last year. Very specific goal, no alcohol at any point during the month of October. Very measurable, very achievable. I won't say it was easy, but it was achievable and certainly relevant to my life and time bound. It was 1 month. And I would know by the end of the month that I had succeeded or failed. And my definition of success or failure was very rigid. It was 1 drop of alcohol equals failure in the month. Now, I also did some other things. We could talk about should goals have any flexibility built into them? What's the accountability? So I did my own accountability in a couple of ways. One was I told people that I was doing it. I told my wife, I told some friends, I told you. And so that just writing it down, announcing it, telling people is one way to make yourself accountable. The other thing I did was I set up a contingency for myself. I set up not a reward, but a punishment. You could do a variety of different ways. But for me, what I had to do, my accountability was if I drank alcohol, my contingency that I set for myself, if I failed in my goal that month, was I had to vote for the opposite presidential candidate in November than I was otherwise planning to vote for. So I set up a kind of a very negative consequence for myself if I failed at my goal.
So that's really interesting. So what I noticed in that,
I'm just, you're right on track. I was just going to say, break that down for us.
Mm-hmm. So what I noticed about it is that you attached an external behavior internally to an emotion and to something that you deeply believed in. So you emotionally bound it. And that actually takes me into another direction, but I'll pause on that for a sec. So with that, in your personal life, you use the traditional SMART goals. And instead of in a professional setting, what I heard, there was a personal goal that you wanted to accomplish in line with what we're talking about today, your own mental health, and then you bound it emotionally. Does that sound... Chris, you're mute.
I thought I was the psychologist here.
I'm just noticing.
But what Dan didn't announce at the top of this meeting is he's actually a better psychologist than I am, and I am secretly using him as my mentor. It's actually not even secret. Dan mentors me on many things. So I guess my question is just one of clarification. What do you mean by emotional bound?
So now what I like to start doing, if you're okay with it, Chris, is kind of start going down and moving off the traditional. So what you just described within that SMART goal is that very, very linear goal setting. And I thank you for sharing that story. So using that linear goal setting, that model, and there's a lot of different models out there. So using that model in maybe a non-traditional way. So not for in a professional setting, but in a personal setting. And I think that's great to note. And there's so much time and energy. Here's a mini rant. We spend a lot of energy within our organizations for other people, for our teams. And now this conversation is actually shifting more to us. Hey, how are these things showing up in our personal life and even within our family? So like when you first opened up, there was things that we did, goal setting, and I consider you family. And so we did this goal setting together as a family. And if we have time, I'll talk about that exercise maybe later on. Right now, what I'd like to do is start to shift a little bit and talk about maybe thoughts and emotions. So with goal setting, it typically is a behavior. Hey, I want to lose weight. Hey, I want to move to this position. Hey, I want to do this thing externally. Now we can use goal setting, even this linear goal setting, for our emotions. And if I'm working with clients and with the topic of resilience, I'll use the word notice. Hey, what do you notice about your emotions? What do you notice about your thoughts? That internal dialogue that happens throughout the day. Is it positive? Is it negative? What emotions do you notice show up in your behaviors? If we were to scale it out, are you mostly angry? Are you mostly frustrated? Are you mostly happy? What are those emotions that show up through the day? And are those the emotions that you want to feel? Are those the thoughts you want to have? And I'll pause there. What's your thoughts on that, Chris?
I missed the very last part of what you said. It might sound quivered on me.
So instead of focusing on external behaviors for goal setting, turning internal and looking and noticing the emotions that we have throughout the day, and noticing the thoughts that we have throughout the day, and asking the question, are those the thoughts that I want to have, or do I want to move in a different direction? And so now now we're starting to creep back to goal setting.
Right. So I really like that. I don't use the word notice, but I use a different phrase that means the same thing. I talk about being a detached observer. As the detached observer within you, what do you see, and what do you hear, and what is your assessment of things? Are you hearing what you want to hear from yourself, or is that internal voice? Is that your demon whispering naughty things and troublesome thoughts and stirring up trouble? So for me, that just noticing that, to use your word, noticing or being the detached observer and paying attention to how you're feeling and what you're thinking and how those thoughts and feelings are connected, I think that's a really valuable exercise. And especially, I think when we're feeling distressed, sometimes distress is a really good, just like pain is a signal. Pain says, hey, your hand is hurting, but you're leaning on the stove that's hot. Move your hand before it burns, before the flesh burns. So you move your hand. But emotions can be a similar kind of signal. And distressing emotions, I think, sometimes what I like to do and what I encourage people I'm working with is to just sit with those emotions. Just let them be. Don't try to push them away. Don't try to distract yourself. Sometimes it's good, maybe it's the middle of the day and something really nasty just happened. Take a break, sit, and just let those feelings be. And what you always find is those emotions, they're not going to destroy you directly. They can indirectly destroy you, but the more you're observing them and noticing them, the better off you're going to be to counter any of that negativity. You're big on reflection.
Yes.
Dan, and I like that. And I've been trying to channel some of your reflectiveness myself over the last few months as I've been thinking about the book we're writing and some of the other projects that we have going both together and separately. I've been trying to just be, we haven't used the word yet, but let's put it out there, mindful. Mindfulness is a big thing. I've just tried to be a little more mindful these days, which often means in the middle of my day taking a 5-minute break, 10-minute break to maybe listen to a little music, maybe to just sit with a problem or a question that I'm struggling with myself. Just set it aside and sit back. Oftentimes I'll even go into another room of the house, just sit in a different chair for a few minutes while I do that. So reflection, I think, is a very powerful. But how do we connect reflection to our use of goals, goal setting, and how we use our goals?
Chris, you covered all. I have a lot of notes just in what you covered right there. So that was great. Thank you. So just some initial thoughts on some of the things that you shared. So with noticing, or being mindful and even reflection, it's easy to judge ourselves. And so even the leadership guided journal that I published, one cover is soft and the other cover is hard. And that's a constant reminder. So if somebody picks up that journal, it's soft and hard. So deep reflection can be hard work, but be soft on yourself. So even when you're noticing and being mindful, and our thoughts as they wander, I recommend moving to a place of curiosity and not judgment. And it's real easy to fall into the category of judgment, whether it's something external that we're looking at or whether it's something internal that we're looking at within ourselves. So recommendation is to be curious. And so as you pause, as you notice, as you reflect, as you're mindful, as you meditate, as you move through the day, is move through with curiosity and look to what you notice. And so now this is where we start moving from something linear to where, hey, we can measure certain things, to maybe a non-linear goal of, hey, I'm just going to see what I notice, or hey, I'm just going to sit with something. And so that goal is to simply be mindful, or that goal can simply be to notice and leave it at that. Sometimes we don't need another thing on the to-do list. Sometimes we don't need another thing to check off. And really this year, just to focus and be resilient and take care of ourselves. And taking care of ourselves starts with noticing our thoughts, noticing our emotions, and noticing on those things that happen internally, how they show up externally. And so just noticing can be a great start to a resilient practice, and just noticing how you're taking care of yourself, what's recharging you, and what's depleting you, what's taking that energy away. And I'll pause there, Chris.
Well, so I think what you're saying, again, summarizing from what I understand, is the process. Reflection can be a process, and reflection, whether we call it reflection, mindfulness, noticing, detached, observing, all of that can be a goal, but it doesn't fit with any of the SMART metrics. Do I have that correct?
Yes.
And so a resilience goal I could set for myself is to be more reflective, and to take time to just notice things. Notice what my thoughts are, notice what I'm feeling, notice what inclinations I have. Do I have the inclination to just pack it in for the day? Do I have the inclination to go have a drink? Do I have the inclination to go for a run? What do my thoughts, feelings, and momentary experiences of the day lead me to feel like doing? That would be one thing to look at in your reflection. What is your gut telling you there? And it's not always something that you should do or healthy to do, but good to notice that.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on this as well. And this is an exercise I don't frequently do. I'll sometimes do with clients, is we'll reflect on the past and we'll see what they notice on past events. And so part of the goal setting, typically goal setting is future oriented. Sometimes we'll set goals and we'll focus and we'll reflect. We'll do journals, we'll do different exercises, and we'll spend time in the past to let go of something. So we'll actually, instead of being future focused with goals, we'll pause, we'll put it in park, and we'll look at some things. We'll spend some time in the rearview mirror to let go of things from the past. Because sometimes with performance, if I have this heavy ruck on that has all this weight, if I stop for a moment and take out some of those bricks and tie my shoe and get some water, so just that pause, instead of like, just grit, just keep going, I'm able, just in that moment, in that break, to take some of that weight, to get some water, to tie my shoe. I'm able, once I start moving again, I'm actually able to move at a faster pace.
Great scene in the movie The Hustler, where Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason have been shooting pool all night long. The stakes are high. Newman's way up, and it's like 3 a.m, 4 a.m, but they're going to keep playing. They take a break. Newman sits around there and stands around the table getting ready for the next round, where Gleason goes into the washroom, washes his face, washes his hands, combs his hair, smooths out his shirt a little bit, and he comes back and he just destroys Newman from that point. That little break, that little short, intervention, just go stand in a private, quiet room, wash my face, comb my hair, look myself in the mirror, and then go back to work. And that was very, very powerful. And Newman talked about that later in the movie. I mean, his character did. Like, he noticed that, like, that guy outsmarted me. He had the patience and the awareness and the ability just to kind of notice what was going on with him and he came back out and beat Newman in the rest of the match. And of course, that's early in the movie, and then there's a whole movie that takes place after that. But I like that a lot. I like that a lot. So resilience itself, or let me rephrase that. Reflection itself could be the goal. And the goal sometimes might not be about things in the future. It might be about reflecting on what happened in the past. Some experience that may have just been momentary. Maybe it was an experience that lasted for weeks, months, or years. Sometimes we call that psychotherapy. I mean, psychotherapy could fit that model, but I think there's a lot of other ways for us to kind of look back into our past and find ways to let go. What are some of the things that you find there?
Hey, Chris, we're getting some questions in the chat, and I'm looking at the time too. And there's one other thing that I'd like to touch on before we start hitting questions and maybe look at wrapping this up. And so resilience and mental health. So another practice that I'll do or I'll work with some of my clients on is creating boundaries. So using goal setting for their own personal boundaries or even personal empowerment. So two different things. So creating boundaries and empowering themselves. So with COVID being in the house and being in a very volatile time, I'm trying to keep this short, being in a very, very volatile time, sometimes we can get caught up externally with a lot of the different things going on. And so it's like, hey, what's something that we can ground ourselves, kind of bring ourselves back to a place that we notice our decisions. Hey, what do we have control over? What are the things that we can get a sense of safety and security back in our lives? What are those daily decisions? What are the boundaries that I can set up? Hey, whether it's around our phone, news, social media, whatever those with other people. So what are those boundaries that we can set up and those things that we can capture our personal power, if you will, those decisions, and really focus on those things to create that safe environment for our own well-being and our own mental health. I'm curious to what your thoughts are on that.
Right. I think the internal goal setting is very valuable. And and like you said, some of the goals that we might set for ourselves are boundary setting. So they're not necessarily measurable. Maybe I set a goal for myself of this year, I'm going to say no to more projects. I'm going to say no so that to some new things, some new opportunities, so that I can focus on current projects, old projects, maybe so that I can have more time for myself and my family. So saying no is a boundary, setting a boundary. And that could be a goal, but it's challenging because it doesn't really fit the SMART metrics.
Yeah, and that was, as I look at the time, and that was just really, if you change the thing you look at, that thing you look at changes.
Yes,
and I love that because
that which you observe changes. It's changed. Yes.
So it shifts perspective. So even as I'm looking at some of the questions that are in the chat. Don't just sit there, do something. You all are pointing out the value also of don't just do something, sit there. So it's really like how I look at almost all things in life is that there's a spectrum. So if we look at tangible goals, this linear approach, if we were to shift perspective, well, what's a nonlinear approach look like? If I'm always working, well, where does play show up? So it's really this balance. Hey, how do we balance those things out? And once again, in that spectrum, that balance point is different for everyone. And I'll pause there for your thoughts, Chris.
Yeah. I'm just going to reread the quote you read because it's a good one. So from Jean Woon, sounds like instead of saying, don't just sit there, do something. Instead of that, sometimes it's good to say, don't just do something. Sit there with it for a little while. Pause the action. Don't jump right back in. Just pause the action a little bit. So That's a really nice kind of summary and a great quote. We also have a question from Nicholas. What are some mindful practices that you recommend for those who have prided themselves on carrying the weight for an extended period of time? So how do you, Dan, how do we tell somebody, let's develop a mindful practice for that person that's the type A, the go-getter, who's always at the front of the team? How do we help that person find a way to allow themselves to rest, to set that weight down for a little while at least?
So as a coach, I wouldn't tell, I would ask. And I would ask, my first question would be, what's important to you about carrying the weight? So I would actually explore the weight carrying.
Yeah.
And then going to the other side, as far as mindful practices, I would ask, what are your thoughts on, like, what does a mindful practice look like to you? Do those show up in your life already? So I would continue talk tracks kind of on both sides of that spectrum that I just described.
Yeah.
So, hey,
I'd also want to know, what does it mean to not carry the weight? Like, why is it important to carry the weight? But what does it mean for you to set the pack down for a little while and not carry it?
And what's that look like?
What does that look like, right?
Yeah.
Who will carry it if you don't? And is it really so critical that you're the one carrying it?
Yeah. So you said there was a couple other things that came up from the last quote. Don't just do something, sit there. And so that goes into a pause practice. And I like working with people on pausing, because so often we react. There's an external event, we react. Mm-hmm. We're at work, something happens, we react. And so where we move to a place of reaction to responding. So the distinction is, one is untrained and one is trained. And so now that goes back to, what do we notice? So for us to notice, we have to pause. So just to pause and say, oh, that's interesting, from that place of curiosity. Hey, that's interesting that so-and-so just did something, and these are the emotions and the sensations that I'm feeling, and these are the thoughts that I'm having. Ooh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Positive or negative, just all part of a pause practice or a noticing practice, mindful reflection. Right. And so as we go throughout the day, just to be more curious and ask ourselves more questions, and to look at the other side of the spectrum. Chris, it's we have a few more minutes. Any thoughts before I hand it over to Michelle?
Well, I'll just close with one, and this goes back to a podcast we did a couple of weeks ago titled "Kissing Your Demon." And I think we all have a demon within us, and the demon whispers little things, says little things, and is rooting against us and trying to persuade us to fail, trying to persuade us to give up, trying to persuade us not to give our all to whatever it is we're doing. And so I think part of the value of reflection, noticing, and detached observing is just, I like to pay attention to what my demon is doing. What's that little booger up to today? What's he telling me? What's he saying? Where is he going to try to trip me today? And if I can notice that and see that, I'm better prepared.
I love it. And I love that you named that voice. So once again, as I'm working with folks, like, hey, what do you notice? And this might sound a little crazy, sometimes there's, the motivator. That person's like, hey, great job. Okay, well, that's a different voice than doubting voice. So those are my, when I feel myself like, hey, you're going to mess up, you're going to do this, you're not good enough, you're not valued. Hey, this thing, it's just like, oh, there you are. Like, I'm not going to there you are. Like, hey, we're not going to do that. We're going to do the opposite. Hey, you have this, you've prepared for it, you've gotten ready, you've put the time in. So just being mindful of those voices and just having, once again, being curious, like, oh, that's interesting. Where did that come from? And so just asking questions. And I love, and here's another small tip, ask what questions. Stay away from why questions. Why questions typically tend to put people on the defensive, including yourself.
Mhm.
Why'd you do that, Dan? Well, why did you, instead of like, ooh, that's interesting, what made you do that? Or what were your thoughts on that?
Mhm.
So as you go through and you reflect and you start notice, stay in that place of curiosity and ask what questions. Chris?
I think it's Michelle's turn now.
Okay. Michelle, what are your thoughts? I'm curious as to what thoughts you have.
So today's conversation was super duper interesting for me. I actually learned a lot. The first point that I got from the both of you is that resilience is not always about pushing through, but it is also about taking yourself back to what you need. In order to be resilient and move forward, you need to be grounded yourself first. And my second point was to show up for yourself. You show up every day for other things. And as Dan said, there's something taking your energy every day, but what gives it back? And that brings me to my final point, the importance of self-assessment and reflection. And this was from Chris, to let your emotions be and just observe, learn more about yourself. And that way you're more prepared for your goals in the future and how to counter them. Yeah, that was pretty much it.
I love it. Thank you. I have some final takeaways. And instead of making statements per my coaching, I'm going to ask some final questions. So these are just questions to reflect upon or meditate on or to think about or notice how they show up a little bit later. So how do you refuel your tank? How do your emotions show up in your behavior? What does something just for you look like? And Michelle, maybe we can post these later. So as I'm going through these fast, we can put these up on the website or on something later. Work and play. How does work and play show up in your life? What gives you a sense of joy during the day? Where can curiosity show up more frequently? Do you constantly react to the environment around you? Or can you pause and respond to the environment? Just a couple more. What do you notice about your decisions, habits, and rituals? How does stress affect you mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually? Yeah, there it is. And if you need some help in there, there's a published guided journal that you can find on my website, Team 3LX. All right. Please join us for the Talent War groups next Tuesday afternoon. Crown of the Barrel, how to manage departing talent, and contact Talent War Group for speaking engagement and EF Overwatch for talent acquisition and retention. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. If you like what you heard and want to continue the conversation, connect with us on LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm at dan.p.luna. Chris, I don't think you're on Instagram. We need to get you on Instagram, pal. Twitter, I'm not on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, but Talent War Group is on all these things. Please share our posts and these sessions with your organization, connection, family, and your friends. If you want to improve yourself, your team, and your organization, any of our team members are available to work directly with you to achieve success. Check out thetalentwar.com and efoverwatch.com to learn more. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Chris. This was awesome. And I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.